I'm not universally beloved, to put it mildly. At one juncture in my life, I was perhaps, and maybe this is correct, the most reviled creature on the face of the earth because of the neutron bomb, which was unquestionably, at that time of its arrival, the most detested weapon on earth.
We are in mortal peril. The neutron bomb would operate as a kind of death ray, easily destroy all life in the target area.
I began to see radiation, nuclear radiation, as an effective means of waging ground warfare in a relatively moral way.
There is an emission of thermal energy.
Enter the neutron bomb.
And neutrons.
A neutron warhead is a defensive weapon designed.
This particular bomb seems to have discovered that radiation kills people. The neutron bomb is no exception. It will kill people. That's
kept
the
ramping
express
up
purpose of it.
and becoming even more lethal. And now we have the neutron bomb. I mean, was the whole idea with the neutron bomb, was it so that they could go into an area and drop this bomb and it wouldn't destroy buildings, it would just kill people, right?
Yes.
Since the beginning of time, man has been devising weapons of destruction. The slingshot, employed by David against Goliath and used by the armies of Alexander the Great. The catapult and the ballista, formidable weapons in their time. The great spears of the Greek warriors and the broad swords of the armored knights. The invention of gunpowder by the Chinese revolutionized warfare and ushered in a new era of explosive munitions through the creation of crude bombs, field artillery, and even hand grenades. World War I saw the development of automatic weapons like the machine gun, the giant artillery cannons, the tank, and the airplane. Toward the end of World War II, man created the first atomic bomb and plunged the world into the atomic age.
Nuclear weapons, created in all shapes and sizes, large ones and small ones. For nearly 75 years, the United States designed and tested these weapons to improve their size, weight, and purpose for a war which may never be waged. One weapon stood out amongst all others in purpose and function, enhancing an invisible yet deadly characteristic of nuclear fusion. This was the neutron bomb.
Enter the neutron bomb.
At the center of this weapon is the neutron. Nestled within the structure of an atom exists a tranquil subatomic particle that possesses no electric charge, called the neutron.
Neutrons were discovered in England in 1932. They were immediately perceived to be immensely valuable for subnuclear research, because unlike the particles that had been used to bombard atoms, to look at them, if you will, up to that time, neutrons could slip into the nucleus, positively charged nucleus of an atom, without being repelled by that positive charge. They would just kind of fall into the nucleus, and then all sorts of interesting things would happen.
These free neutrons can invade the foundation of matter and create useful isotopes for medicine and industry. Free neutrons, however, can be extremely hazardous to all living things. Free neutrons are produced within the heart of a nuclear reactor, or from a chain reaction created in the detonation of an atomic bomb. From the beginning of nuclear testing in 1945, neutrons have maintained a special interest in all atomic tests.
When the scientists at Los Alamos worked on the targeting of the first bombs on the Japanese cities during the Second World War, they were concerned that these weapons not be perceived to be some new kind of poison gas. They were concerned that the primary destructive force that was harnessed would be blast and fire, but not radiation. They were, however, aware that one of the first kinds of radiation coming off a nuclear fireball would be prompt neutrons, a huge flux of neutrons, and that those neutrons would kill anyone within a certain range. What they calculated, however, was that anyone who would be killed by the neutron flux would probably be killed by the blast of the explosion as well.
First, there is an emission of thermal energy, gamma rays and neutrons. Depending upon the altitude of the burst, the neutrons reach the target in large or small quantities. The gamma rays extend far from the target center. In general, radiation causes ionization in the component atoms of cells, altering their chemical nature and impairing or destroying their normal functions. With whole body radiation, ionization causes loss of function of the more sensitive tissues and organs. The degree of loss depends upon the dosage. If the exposure is both general and severe, death results.
In May of 1945, the war in Europe came to an end. Nazi Germany was defeated. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met cordially at Yalta and Potsdam to discuss the fate of Germany. The Allies agreed that the countries they had occupied should be liberated and that freely elected governments should be encouraged. But for the countries occupied by Russia, Stalin had other plans. The Russians kept their army intact, overwhelmingly maintaining the largest military force in Europe. Then, Russia decided to cut off the Allied sectors of Berlin from the west. Trains and road transports were stopped. Electric power was cut. West Berlin was isolated from the free world. The response was the Berlin Airlift. For the next 11 months, American, British, and French planes landed one after another, delivering supplies of food, coal, and petroleum into the besieged city. The Russian blockade of Berlin had brought Europe to the brink of war. It was at last clear that only a strong defensive alliance could deter them from further aggression. On April 4th, 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed by 12 Western nations. This alliance became known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
In 1949, there were a series of very momentous events happening on the geopolitical stage. One of them, of course, in April 1949 was the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was a group of 12 nations, including the United States and several other European nations, which together created a security alliance where the whole would be greater than the sum of the parts.
The fact that the Soviet Union had taken over Eastern Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War as part of the spoils of victory. The fact that therefore there was, as Winston Churchill famously said in 1946, an iron curtain drawn across Europe, with the Soviet communist world on one side and the Western, we hoped, democratic world on the other side.
The loss of China, if you will, to the communists. And then finally, I suppose we could say this sense of crisis culminated in August of 1949 when the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb, which was then announced to the American people about a month later in September 1949.
Early nuclear operations focused on training American and NATO ground troops in the use of atomic weapons on the battlefield.
Nuclear weapons can, to put it crudely, be divided into two categories. One of them would be tactical nuclear weapons, which would be for use on a battlefield. These would be small yield weapons that would be designed to be used in particular theaters of operation.
Theater and tactical nuclear weapons are to some degree interchangeable terms, but theater basically refers to a particular area of conflict, thus the Korean War theater, the European theater.
And at the other end of the spectrum are the strategic nuclear weapons, the weapons that are large enough to destroy entire cities.
In the summer of 1951, more than 100 scientists and academics participated in Project Vista, a secret study hosted by the California Institute of Technology. Vista's purpose was to determine how existing technologies supported by nuclear weapons could offset NATO's weaker conventional forces and repel a massive Soviet invasion.
Vista was a special project. It was initiated both by the Air Force and then also by the U.S. Army. And the whole idea of Vista was to study the ways in which Western Europe might be defended against a massive Soviet attack. And of course, one of the technologies that was looked at, and probably the most controversial aspect of the Vista report, was that the United States should develop lots of small-scale, low-yield tactical nuclear weapons and deploy these for use on the battlefield, meaning that the United States would counter Soviet superiority in manpower and tanks with American superiority when it came to nuclear armaments.
As Robert Oppenheimer told the Army in his lecture in the early 1950s, they were always too big. How do you make them little? And if you make them little, does that put everything at risk of crossing what was an increasing barrier between conventional weapons, as we now call them, and nuclear weapons?
Mr. President Von Prem, CBS News. Yesterday at his news conference, Secretary of State Dulles indicated that in the event of general war in the Far East, we would probably make use of some tactical small atomic weapons. Would you care to comment on this and possibly explain it further?
Well, in any combat where these things can be used on strictly military targets and for strictly military purposes, I see no reason that they shouldn't be used just exactly as you'd use a bullet or anything else.
Can't we design some that could be used by the Army? Remember, Eisenhower was an Army man, wasn't an Air Force pilot. So he was concerned that the Army have the benefit of these very powerful and efficient and lightweight, relatively speaking, explosives. Therefore, he commissioned all sorts of efforts to find ways to make battlefield scale nuclear weapons.
The battleground of the future may well be a nuclear battleground. And the nuclear weapon is perhaps the greatest challenge to the foot soldier in military history. The United States Army believes it is a challenge that can be met, and that today's soldier has a chance of surviving this new weapon, just as the soldier of the past was able to survive the weapons of his day.
Keeping in mind that your first priority, as always, is to perform your assigned task, now let's see what protective measures you can take against an atomic attack. For atomic defense, you need a deeper hole than usual. Have a minimum of 3 feet between ground level and the top of your body in crouching position. The sides may crumble, but this foxhole will give you very good protection against flying missiles, heat, and radiation. Have faith in your leaders. They will ensure that you do not get more radiation than is absolutely necessary. Your weapons and equipment may also be contaminated by radioactive fallout. If your immediate assignment requires their use, go ahead and use them. The risk from not carrying out your job will be more critical than the amount of radiation you get. You can decontaminate your equipment in the field by sweeping or scraping it down.
Today, the Army is training its soldiers against possible nuclear warfare and teaching them the most effective methods of defense against atomic attack. There is no minimizing the potency of the nuclear weapon, but today's soldier, well informed as to the nature of that weapon and well trained in test explosions over the last few years, has a better chance of survival on the atomic battlefield.
In November of 1952, an event took place which was to have a profound effect on the scientific and political climate of the world. This event was the detonation of Ivy Mike, the first full-scale test of a thermonuclear device. The blast produced a flood of neutrons. In an instant, experiments were exposed to more than 10 times the neutrons that similar experiments could be exposed to by a nuclear reactor in a year. This caught the interest of some in at least 2 separate fields, that of bomb design and the associated diagnoses of bomb performance, and those interested in collateral effects, the incidental reaction to material and people in particular. The experimental hydrogen bomb test verified that an extremely high flux or surge of neutrons had occurred within the Ivy Mike detonation.
What comes off? Well, a lot of different kinds of radiation, but one of the most prominent kinds, an enormous flux of neutrons. And these neutrons in turn, as the scientist Philip Morrison commented about our first big test, those neutrons produced every element on the periodic table and a bunch of man-made elements all the way up through from 92 to 116 on the now bigger periodic table of man-made elements.
Intrigued, the Atomic Energy Commission established a study program to investigate this particular characteristic of nuclear weapons. Several subsequent events would help to shape the development of the neutron bomb. Castle Bravo, the largest nuclear test conducted by the United States, exploded, delivering a promptly lethal dose of radioactive fallout to more than 6,000 square miles of the Pacific Ocean, injuring the Marshall Islanders and some Japanese fishermen caught inside the danger zone. In response to the public alarm over fallout, Louis Strauss, chairman of the AEC, requested both weapon laboratories to investigate the possibility of reducing radioactive fallout through designing clean multi-megaton weapons, relying almost entirely on fusion.
I have been visited by people that certainly by reputation and common knowledge are among the most eminent scientists in this field. Among them, Dr. Lawrence and Dr. Teller. What they are working on is this, the production of clean bombs. They tell me that already they are producing bombs that have 96% less fallout than was the case in our original ones, or what they call dirty bombs. But they go beyond this. They say, give us 4 or 5 years to test each step of our development, and we will produce an absolutely clean bomb, so that the weapon becomes completely military in its application. If you use it on the battlefield, you will have an effect only so far as its blast and heat waves reach, and there will be no fallout to injure any civilian or any innocent bystanders that are off X miles, or the necessary distance to get out of the area of heat and blast. Moreover, they go to say this: if you are going to get the full value out of the atomic science in peaceful development, that is, let us assume that there are no more bombs made or used, and you want to make certain that you are getting the best out of this new science for the peaceful uses of mankind, these tests must go on.
The weapon laboratories vigorously pursued clean nuclear weapon technology, which would minimize fission in favor of radioactively cleaner fusion. This would be an important step toward development of the neutron bomb. However, success in developing clean nuclear weapons wasn't easy. At first, only extremely large nuclear bombs could be made clean. The government tested such devices in the Pacific as part of Operation Red Wing in 1956. Conducted at Bikini Atoll, these megaton tests were over 200 times the yield of the bomb which leveled Hiroshima, and of which the majority of the explosive force was considered clean from fusion. These weapons could only be considered clean when compared to their dirty counterparts, yet still included tens of kilotons of fissionable material. The military needed small, low-yield weapons for the future battlefields of Europe. Small tactical weapons in the fractional kiloton range, only 1,000th the size of the Nagasaki atomic bomb. But these were still radiologically dirty devices, and their fallout threatened collateral damage for Allied troops on the battlefield. Meanwhile, testing continued with tactical fission bombs for the battlefield. The government tested competing designs for the Davy Crockett battlefield nuke. During these tests, pigs placed in tactical environments were used as biological targets, with immediate lethality from radiation as the principal objective.
Move it up a little bit. Thank you. I'd like the first slide, please. Our primary objective was to determine the immediate lethal response to the Humboldt device. Next. Here are the animals 12 minutes after detonation. You can see that they hardly move at all. This one was very close to the front of the APC at 25 yards, and he is manifesting central nervous system syndrome due to the acute central nervous system radiation injury. Next. All of these animals have received an average dose of 40,000 rads. Next. They were all alive for at least 2.5 hours. You can obviously see how stunned these animals are. Next. This is pure, prompt neutron gamma radiation injury. We've been getting requests from commanders repeatedly concerning how much radiation it takes to kill a human immediately, or how much radiation it would take to stop an infantryman in his tracks, or to prevent him from driving a truck, or prevent him from pulling a trigger. Obviously, no one can give an exact answer on this with respect to human beings. The group decided a person had to be 10% efficient just to pull a trigger. To assault a position with any hope of survival, he should be 90% efficient. If a commander is interested in incapacitating 50% of a group of troops so that 50% of them cannot pull a trigger, 3,000 rads would be necessary. If the commander were interested, say, in a period of 1 hour, he would have to deliver 10,000 rads to incapacitate 50% of these troops so that they couldn't pull a trigger. Now at 8 hours, the dose is reduced again because radiation sickness has taken over. And by 24 hours, 1,000 rads would have sufficed initially. Now with respect to killing immediately, no one knows how much radiation it would take to kill 50% of a unit within 5 minutes. The dose would certainly be most fantastic. At 30 minutes, it is estimated that the dose would still be greater than 100,000 rats. Are there any questions? Anthony?
You see, here's the problem. Immediate lethality only occurred where the test subjects would have been killed by the force of the blast anyway. If you're gonna weaponize radiation, you want it to incapacitate the enemy immediately, not 2 days or a week later.
Enter Sam Cohen, the architect of the neutron bomb, who began his career at Los Alamos, providing the neutron calculations for the Fat Man atomic bomb.
Real early on, I began to see radiation, nuclear radiation, as an effective means of waging ground warfare in a relatively moral way.
The Army called for the use of atomic weapons to break the stalemate in the Korean War, advocating field tests to establish a doctrine for battlefield use.
And I was dispatched as an observer to see what was happening there, and then in the back of my mind, wonder about the application of tactical nuclear weapons. But now here I was in the middle of a war going on, and I saw the hideous carnage of the innocents and destruction of their habitats and their industries, and all the structures that made their lives viable. And this was all done by non-nuclear weapons. And we did just as good a job with our conventional weapons as the bomb that leveled Hiroshima did. So-called little boy bomb. What Seoul looked like when I entered Seoul for the first time looked almost exactly like Hiroshima after the bomb. And then wandering around the countryside and seeing the awful state of the peasantry and seeing how they were affected by the war and by our weaponry. And that's what it's always been about. And it's immoral. It's just plain immoral. Now, excuse me, it's not irrational. Because that's what war has always been about. Use the biggest bombs you can. Blast the living daylights out of all these goddamn cities, which is precisely what we did in World War II. And we did a beautiful job against Germany and Japan with fire bombs and large high explosive bombs. And we killed countless, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of innocent urban dwellers. and that ain't right. That's immoral. That's the way it was fought. That's just the way that war was. And I was all for it. And I'm not about to damn myself and condemn myself for the attitude that I had. It was typically American. You blast the bad guys, into oblivion. And bad guys being men, women, and children. And not a feeling of wretchedness, of guilt. Not in the slightest. This began to put a little sense of what I would call moral decency into me. Namely, if you want to go to war, and sometimes you have to, try and keep it as clean as you can. So we drove into Seoul, and we had to drive across a bridge on the Han River. And this bridge looked like it had a case of smallpox. It just cratered as a result of countless high explosive bombs that had pocked it up, but it was never destroyed. It was built so firmly. And so the first question I asked myself, suppose we dropped a nuclear weapon on that bridge. It would go into the river. Now, that bridge was a very important part of our military exercises. And so it was a real military asset. So I began getting ideas. But now, from a moral standpoint, I would not have regarded the destruction of that bridge as immoral, because it could have been done with a very low yield, accurately delivered nuclear weapon. And it would not have destroyed the town of Seoul or anything else like that. It simply would have destroyed the bridge.
While the phones are ringing off the hook tonight, this is a very interesting topic. Do you think that using a neutron bomb, is that a moral issue? Because Sam Cohen, he talks about how he felt that it was a moral weapon to use this on somebody else.
I think drones are the way to go myself.
Maybe I could fill in.
All right, well, thank you so much, Sam. We have another caller. Well, thank you for calling. Do you think that it's a moral issue, the neutron bomb? I'm stuck on this moral issue. We have a call on the line. This is Jim from Orange County.
Hi.
Are you familiar with the effects of a neutron bomb? And we're not just talking about an immediate death. This is horrific. All right, Jim. Well, thank you very much for your call. Well, pretty interesting, huh? Mm-hmm. They love or hate this guy.
I went to work for a very famous Air Force general who masterminded our ICBM development. And that's Benny Schriever, General Bernard Schriever. And here's a guy who had devised a thermonuclear ballistic missile that would have killed God only knows how many millions. But at the same time, regarding the battlefield, he began hammering at me. See, I was his nuclear advisor. He was running a planning shop for the Air Force in the Pentagon. He began hammering on me. Sam, he says, why don't you give me a weapon? It won't produce all these horrendous effects on innocents. He says, it's a logical thing to do. Now, what I had to do is I had to look for a warhead that had the necessary characteristics. And so I used to pay very frequent visits up to the Livermore Nuclear Laboratory in Northern California. And I'd always visit with the director of the lab. We were very good friends. And I asked him if anything new in your developments. Well, on this particular visit, he said yes. He said, but I'm not quite sure if you'd be interested. I said, why are you hesitant about my interest? He says, this is a non-military warhead. This is for peaceful applications, for the so-called Project Plowshare. Turn swords into plowshares.
The United States is conducting, for the benefit of all nations, a program it calls Plowshare.
The great and violent power of nuclear explosion can be used for peaceful purposes. We call this project Plowshare. Geographical engineering. Move great amounts of earth. Build canals, harbors. Use nuclear explosives, like high explosives have been used, for the purpose of mining. Use nuclear explosives in the bowels of the earth, using the earth itself as the crucible. We built up a physics laboratory right down there in the salt mine to find out more about the neutrons which make nuclear explosives and nuclear reactors tick. We try to do the best to develop further this great tool, nuclear energy, for peaceful purposes. But at the very outset, we were convinced of one thing. The most interesting thing that we might find out may be something which no one expects, a surprise.
No, I really wasn't all that much interested in the peaceful application of nuclear devices. And he called the project heads of two projects who were working on these clean, peaceful nuclear weapons to come in and brief me on these weapons. And they were through briefing. See, they were thermonuclear, fusion, not fission. When they were through briefing me, I asked them, I said, how many neutrons come out? They said, well, we have to make a quick calculation. And the answer was, essentially all of the neutrons came out. They weren't absorbed into the device. Well, with that, I said, thanks a lot. And I excused myself, and I raced for the airport, went back to Santa Monica to the Rand Corporation where I was working, up to my office. I took out a slide rule my dad had given me on my 15th birthday when I had displayed an interest in science. And I made the necessary calculations. I knew how to make neutron calculations real good. And lo and behold, what came out of these calculations was a weapon that, if burst at a proper altitude, would kill bad guys underneath, but spare the properties, the cities and towns of the good guys. And voila! Here is how the neutron bomb came about.
What would someone expect to feel or experience from the effects of the neutron bomb?
Well, it depends how close you are to the birth point. If you're roughly 1,000 yards away, you, within a matter of minutes, are going to be rendered totally incapacitated. And physiologically, you will be one of the most miserable creatures imaginable. You will be vomiting your guts out. Your head will be bursting as your central nervous system has been knocked out of order, and within a matter of considerably less than an hour, you'll be dead. But within a matter of minutes, you'll be unable to conduct combat operations. So you're gone. If you go a few more 100 yards out, then you can pick up a non-lethal dose that will still have effects on you. You'll survive it. You'll live through it, but you will not feel very well. And you'll feel disoriented. You won't be violently ill, like the poor guy, at 1,000 yards, but nevertheless, you will not be physically or mentally capable of conducting combat operations. So if you're talking about a tank crew that picks up this dose, they won't be able to work their tank for a while. Now, if they were out of the combat theater, I'd say, well, fine and dandy. They'll pull through. They won't be very happy for a while. Doses far less those that produce these god-awful, hideous effects and still have the desired military result of putting an enemy soldier out of action. Because the neutron bomb is the most discriminate weapon ever devised. There's a very sharp cutoff between the radius out to which the enemy will be killed and where the friendly troops are positioned. After the war is over, instead of having a continent of devastation, physical devastation, it'll be a physically intact continent. From a radioactivity standpoint, the radioactive effects will be, to a first approximation, zero, zilch. And the area under the burst will be inhabitable immediately. And if the burst is used in a city and the populace has taken common sense steps to protect themselves by digging shelters against the radiation, the neutron radiation, then they won't be touched.
Further developments of the neutron bomb would have to wait, as Eisenhower imposed a moratorium on nuclear testing through the end of his presidential term. Undeterred by the moratorium, Sam continued his research with fellow strategists at the Rand Corporation, whose responsibility was to formulate and shape military policy. At Rand, Sam continued to pursue his vision of a bomb that would one day weaponize neutron radiation.
I went into analysis, strictly Freudian, and this went on for about 6 years. And it was 6 of the most agonizing yet fascinating years of my life, because thanks to listening to myself, because I had no choice. See, I had the analyst, and the son of a bitch, he would just sit there, and he wouldn't say a word. I was, to a certain extent, and this would vary from individual to individual, a neurotic. I wasn't a psychotic. At this stage of the game, I might say, I was employed in security work, doing nuclear weapons work, and I had top secret clearances and so on and so forth. So if I'd been psychotic, I never would have gotten a job or let alone clearances. I was working with a think tank called the Rand Corporation, which has become world famous in Santa Monica, California. And I was in with a group of extremely bright guys, to put it mildly. They were not only bright, but to a very, very high percentage level. They were neurotic as all hell, just like I was. Okay. And now having this analytic background, in allowing me to understand people, I began to see these guys who were being driven by their neuroses. Now, the Rand Corporation had a huge effect on our nuclear policies. They had it all figured out on computers. And the computers were based on mathematical models. And the mathematical models were based on their neurotic way of thinking. But they're with us. Now, the question, push came to shove, and we wound up in a nuclear war. Would it go according to these policies and strategies? No. Absolutely no way. How it would go? Heaven only knows. I don't. Despite all the profound calculations by such geniuses as the late great Herman Kahn, the master of thermonuclear war and so on. You see, Herman, who had a huge effect on Washington thinking, believed we could fight and win a thermonuclear war. He pretended to really believe it. Now, the truth of the matter is, he didn't believe it one bit, but he was a natural-born showman, and he desperately needed attention.
Man looks not only to their great energy, but also to their relative size and cost. He sees that a 10-kiloton nuclear explosive, for example, could be as small as 15 inches in diameter and 3 feet long. The price would be about $350,000. Furthermore, if he increases the nuclear yield 200 times, up to 2 megatons, the package is only about 2 feet greater in diameter and 7 feet longer, and the price barely doubles.
I visited the Pentagon, and I was introduced to Tom Moore, who was a fledgling rear admiral in charge of long-range planning for the Navy, by a colleague of his. So I come into Moore's office and I take out my briefing charts and I go through my song and dance. And when I'm all through, he has practically gone through the ceiling. He really got excited. And he said, "Do you mind if I ask you to give your briefing around certain corners of the Navy in the Pentagon?" I said, "Of course I don't mind. You arrange for it and I'll show up." And before you knew it, you had an exponentiating chain reaction. I had briefed every significant quarter of the Navy in the Pentagon, all the way on up to the Chief of Naval Operations. And they wanted that bomb. Thanks to the Navy pressures, it worked its way out of the Navy and into the office of the Secretary of Defense. And there was this briefing in his conference room, to the Secretary's conference room. And I was on stage with my charts. And in the audience were a bunch of very senior characters, in the Pentagon, including an admiral by the name of Arthur Radford, who was then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And when I was all through, Admiral Radford muttered, "If we only had these weapons at Dien Bien Phu," this was during the French war in Indochina, "and it would have been ideal for us in Vietnam. Had we used these weapons in Vietnam, we could have won that war in short order." and save God only knows how many thousands upon thousands of American soldier boys' lives.
Throughout 1959, Sam continued to pitch his fusion weapon concept to various agencies of the government, including the Department of Defense, the State Department, the CIA, the Atomic Energy Commission, and the National Security Council Planning Board. It was during this time period that this advanced weapon concept became popularly known by the press as the neutron bomb, generating the kind of hysteria that could only be created by the premiere of a Hollywood movie. News of the neutron bomb spread quickly as the revelation of this newly proposed weapon raced across newspapers, television, and radio. It took root in the political landscape and resounded through Congress. Connecticut's Democratic Senator Thomas J. Dodd became the neutron bomb's most enthusiastic proponent, telling Congress,
"We are in mortal peril. More than a year has passed since I first spoke on the folly of the test ban moratorium. I mentioned the neutron bomb would operate as a kind of death ray. It would do next to no physical damage and result in no contamination, but it would immediately destroy all life in the target area. Today, I doubt there is a single nuclear physicist of repute who would challenge the neutron bomb from the standpoint of feasibility. It can be built, but nothing can be done to build it until we are free to resume nuclear testing."
Responding to Senator Dodd, Linus Pauling proclaims,
"We have had one principal reason for hope during the last 3 years, the negotiations for a bomb test agreement being carried out in Geneva, and now there is a great effort being made by the forces of militarism in the United States to break off the negotiations in Geneva and to start up bomb tests again. The greatest foe of the peace movement and the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy is Senator Thomas J. Dodd. He, in his speech on the 12th of May, 1960, urged that we stop trying to make an international agreement to stop the testing of all nuclear weapons, that the United States immediately resume the testing of nuclear weapons, and now he is ballyhooing what he calls a neutron bomb. This is a great fraud. Senator Dodd said, if the Soviets were to get it first, it might well cost us our freedom. If the day should ever come when the Kremlin forces a showdown crisis over Berlin and then demonstrates its possession of the neutron bomb, we would find ourselves confronted with the choice of capitulation in Europe or all-out nuclear war. This is pure poppycock. The neutron bomb is a fraud, a hoax, and nothing more."
Former Atomic Energy Commissioner Thomas Murray sent an ominous letter to presidential candidates Kennedy and Nixon, warning that the Russians were developing new types of atomic weapons, which could lead to nuclear blackmail unless the United States was allowed to resume testing. Murray identified 2 different weapons on the drawing board, whose code names were synonymous with the neutron bomb. Contemplated as a battlefield weapon, Eisenhower eventually had reservations about the concept of the neutron bomb.
He didn't like it. For his own, I consider to be grossly immoral reasons. He didn't believe in battlefield nuclear weapons, regardless of how discriminate they might be. Even though he had these thousands of nuclear weapons under his command, battlefield weapons, tactical weapons under his command, I don't think he ever would have made that call. We'll never know.
Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense.
we have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals.
Soon after Eisenhower left office, the newly elected president and NATO allies were faced with renewed threats over West Berlin by the Soviet Union. On August 30th, 1961, the Russians broke the nuclear testing moratorium, culminating with the detonation of a 57-megaton hydrogen bomb, allowing the United States to proceed with a new series of tests. Many of those tests, conducted in the fall of 1961, were designs considered for low-yield tactical use, including continued development of the neutron bomb. Despite its growing reputation as the government's worst-kept rumor, the neutron bomb was back in the news.
Mr. President, there's been a lot of talk recently about the development of a neutron bomb. Could you give us your estimate of the feasibility of developing a weapon which would destroy human beings without destroying real estate values? No.
Publicly, Kennedy refused to discuss the neutron bomb. Privately, however, he debated the use of the weapon he referred to as the fusion bomb.
About the fusion, General, do you want to say something? Based on the characteristics of the fusion weapon, there's some difference between the characteristics. We believe there's advantage to having it. There was, a couple years ago, a general belief that the fusion weapon was a special kind of battlefield weapon. That it was a pure fusion weapon that could be used to kill troops without doing blast damage and without leaving radioactivity behind. But it was a rather detailed study that was made last year when we were going around this, a little more light, showed that this was a mixed blessing because while it killed a few people close in rapidly, it was really a time bomb, sent to most of the people who got the neutron blast were not killed instantaneously. In fact, they're not in bad health, but we're going to die in a period of 12 hours to 2 weeks. So that we could be creating on the battlefield is essentially a kamikaze situation. The troops would have to think whether or not you wanted to do that.
These troops, forming a special task force, were the first in our Army's history to engage in a tactical exercise supported by live nuclear firepower. This field exercise was not a wargaming maneuver, but rather a pre-designed demonstration of the tactical employment of low-yield nuclear weapons in conjunction with conventional weapons.
By this time, I think the rest of the group had all reached the same conclusion I had reached, that some limited wars can best be fought with a combination of conventional weapons plus nuclear weapons for appropriate tactical targets. It could mean the difference between winning now or fighting for months.
In 1964, important steps in this direction were taken in experiments with nuclear explosives specially designed to produce high-intensity neutron radiation. the specific characteristic that promotes isotope formation. In 100 millionth of a second, more neutrons were released by each explosion than could be released over decades in the most efficient nuclear reactor. The blast pumped these neutrons into targets of uranium, producing isotopes of very heavy elements beyond uranium. Eventually, Plowshare scientists hope to use these heavier elements as targets in nuclear explosions.
Over the next decade, 26 nuclear tests would be conducted under Project Plowshare for the development of peaceful nuclear weapons. The neutron bomb continued to be aided by advancements in this technology. The future looked bright for peaceful nuclear explosions. But unrealized expectations and public and political opposition doomed the program to closure. Plowshare quietly ended in 1977. Without Plowshare, the path the neutron bomb would take would be bumpy. The neutron bomb found early success as the warhead for the Sprint missile. The Sprint was an anti-ballistic missile, or ABM, designed to explode and deliver a blast of neutrons, rendering incoming ICBMs inoperable. The Sprint was capable of hypersonic speeds. Reaching temperatures twice the melting point of steel would cause the missile to glow as it shot through the atmosphere. However, high costs, questionable results, and a lack of congressional support retired the Sprint in 1975. In the ever-changing world of defense, Sam's advocacy for his neutron bomb was falling increasingly on deaf ears. The Air Force favored its strategic programs, like the ICBM and long-range bomber. The Navy favored the Polaris as its nuclear weapon of choice. The Army was preoccupied with the Vietnam War and stewardship of the Sentinel ABM program. Lyndon Johnson had little interest in Cold War confrontation as he reduced government support for many programs to pay for the Vietnam War. After Vietnam, the government and the military returned to a strategy of flexible response, reviving interest in tactical nuclear weapons.
All right, you'll be working on this assignment in groups. Barker, your group will develop plans using only conventional weapons. Fox, you have no restrictions. You may use any weapons in the arsenal, including nuclear ones, against any targets you deem suitable. Malloy, your group also has permission to use nuclear weapons, but you're restricted to using them against tactical targets. Our next get-together will be on Thursday to receive your reports. That's all, gentlemen.
In 1973, the Army Chief of Staff produced a memorandum requesting a study to re-examine nuclear artillery. The study requested radiation dose requirements for incapacitating military personnel and minimizing collateral damage.
The goal is to establish a valid and consistent model from which military planners can predict the probability of mission accomplishment in a wide range of operational situations. A project involving 10 primates was initiated to determine gross performance efficiency after irradiation. The reactor is programmed and the subject positioned to receive a mid-head dose of approximately 10,000 rads of mixed gamma and neutron radiation in a period of about 50 microseconds. These parameters approximate the dose and delivery rate that might be anticipated following the detonation of a nuclear weapon.
Hello there. Are you conscious?
Can you hear us? Can you see this light?
We'd like to ask you some questions. Is that okay?
What was the last thing you remember before the blast? Were you unconscious at any time? If so, do you know for how long? In the period immediately following the blast, do you remember any inability to perform major functions? If so, how long did that impairment last?
Are you sick or nauseated? Did you vomit after the attack?
Good evening. The neutron bomb is back in the news.
Senator Stuart Symington, head of the Committee on Atomic Energy, was a staunch opponent of the neutron bomb. This opposition evaporated when Symington retired from the Senate in 1976, thereby opening the door to approval of the neutron bomb. Quietly, the neutron bomb was reintroduced into the Energy Department's budget request. The neutron bomb had reappeared after secretly being inserted into a House Appropriations bill during the Carter administration.
Do I have any questions?
How do you reconcile your decision to go ahead with the neutron bomb with your inaugural pledge to eliminate all nuclear weapons? Also, why didn't you know the money was in the bill? And three, doesn't this escalate the arms race? And I have a follow-up.
Well, it's a very serious question. In the first place, I did not know it was in the bill. The enhanced radiation or neutron bomb has been discussed and also has been under development for 15 or 20 years. It's not a new concept at all, not a new weapon. It does not affect our assault or strategic weapons negotiations at all. It's strictly designed as a tactical weapon. Before I make a final decision on a neutron bomb's deployment, I would do a complete impact statement, analysis on it, submit this information to the Congress, but I have not yet decided whether to approve the neutron bomb. I do think it ought to be one of our options, however.
Almost immediately, funding for the neutron bomb faced opposition by then Oregon Senator Mark Hatfield, who blocked finances for the weapon.
I think that argument is the very reason why we should be very reticent to embark upon this system, because there's more of an invitation to use it and to introduce it into conventional warfare.
Some of the opponents of this particular bomb seem to have discovered that radiation kills people. They also seem to have discovered that bombs kill people. All weapons kill people. Nuclear weapons are dangerous, there is no doubt about it. The neutron bomb is no exception. It will kill people. That's the express purpose of it.
Initially, Carter opposed the neutron bomb, which was on its way to being fitted for use as an artillery shell and as the warhead for the Lance missile. Although the Lance had been on the drawing board since the mid-1950s and eventually introduced into the U.S. arsenal, it wasn't until 1977 when the Lance was ready to move into the production phase for its neutron warhead.
The 6-kiloton device was to be used in a tactical missile called the Lance, battlefield missile. The Army never wanted these damn things. They never did from the very beginning, but it was forced upon them by the president toward keeping a promise, okay? Well, in designing specifications for how the weapon would be used, it was to be exploded as close to the surface as possible to avoid contact, which might have produced wide-scale radioactive fallout, like a few hundred feet above the surface. And the reason being, the Army never trusted radiation. What it wanted was physical demolishment of enemy tanks. The military did not want people to know that it did not have a significant blast component, that it had a reduced blast component, fine and dandy.
The neutron bomb would move from one conflict to another, from the battlefields of Congress to the front lines of Europe.
That was where the battle would be fought. But it was densely populated with human beings. Germany in particular, which is where the line was really drawn between East and West Germany, was densely populated. How could you use nuclear weapons without killing more friendly civilians than enemy combatants? The idea of a neutron bomb was if you could suppress the blast and fire effects of a nuclear weapon and enhance the neutron effects of a nuclear weapon, you might be able to have a weapon that would kill those guys inside those tanks, but with minimal damage to the German countryside. Germany is a densely populated country. The German leadership really very early on understood, as I think Helmut Schmidt said later on, one nuclear explosion in my country and the war would be over as far as we're concerned. We'd stop. We wouldn't fight anymore because there's no point in destroying your country to save it.
NATO members could not agree on deployment of the neutron bomb, saying it is militarily useful, but politically dangerous.
And I can assure you that the SACEUR would not ask for the use of those weapons unless he projected that the defense was no longer going to be viable, and therefore we face two choices. One, to be overrun and to give up, which is not very viable to me, or two, to resort to the use of theater nuclear weapons, which is also not very viable to me.
The neutron bomb kills people the same way monkeys are killed in this armed forces laboratory, by huge doses of radiation.
While pressure erupted from all sides and countries on the issue, President Carter postponed production of the neutron bomb.
And I'm looking forward to going to get some rest.
The Senate seemed to turn down the neutron bomb by one vote today.
Oh, did they? That's a matter I haven't gotten into very deeply. We'll look into it in the future.
Do you think the neutron bomb is really essential?
I don't know. I'll see you later.
A neutron warhead is a defensive weapon designed to offset the superiority that the Soviet Union has on the Western Front against the NATO nations. You also have to remember that those who are crying the loudest, the Soviet Union, and many of those who, under the name of pacifism in Western Europe, who are opposing things like this, are really carrying the propaganda ball for the Soviet Union.
President Reagan, many people don't realize this, came to office with a personal dream that he had been pursuing ever since 1945 to get rid of all the nuclear weapons in the world. That was the famous summit at Reykjavik in 1986. But he was shrewd enough to realize that he would have to start by building up the U.S. military to such a high level that no one domestically or on the Soviet side could claim he was weak on defense. So the first thing he did was double the U.S. defense budget. And in doing so, they had to go to the farthest reaches of their dream book that they could use to spend all that money on. And I think the reason the neutron bomb reemerges a little bit during the early years of the Reagan administration, we got all this money, the president wants us to spend it, okay, let's throw that back into the mix. Maybe we should work on that a little more.
That was one of his principal themes. And he promised, if elected president, I will develop and stockpile that weapon. And he kept his promise, incidentally. But he went back on it from the following standpoint. It was stockpiled in the United States, not in Europe. It was the only place where they could have been of any good. And the reason being is that the Europeans, who really detested my bomb, wouldn't have anything to do with it. I put up a big holler. And you know how much good that did me? On the positive side, 0. On the negative side, a lot of harm. As a matter of fact, the fellow who really ran the Air Force, the famous, infamous General Curtis LeMay, he tried to crush me and bring my briefings to a halt.
But LeMay, as well as the other Air Force generals who were part of Strategic Air Command, had a distinct preference not so much for small-scale tactical nuclear weapons, but for the large strategic nuclear weapons that they wanted to use to lay waste to Soviet cities and Soviet industrial infrastructure.
General LeMay wanted all the bombs, and he wanted big bombs, the bigger the better, because his idea of how to prevent an attack on the United States by the Soviet Union was to attack the Soviet Union before they could attack us, either in the final minutes of a conflict before it went nuclear, or, God knows, as a preemptive war, which was seriously discussed.
Now, really and truly, from the very beginning, the Army never wanted battlefield nuclear weapons. Never. The reason being, they'd done some studies, which they decided to take seriously for political reasons. They showed it was impossible to fight a battlefield nuclear war in Europe without wiping out half of Europe and contaminating the other half.
The idea of a weapon that would just kill people and leave the neighborhood intact, so to speak, had a really bad smell to it for most people. It sounded like what had gone on in Nazi Germany in the Second World War, if you will. Let's just kill everybody around and then we'll take over their buildings, their houses, and their factories, and so forth. So from that point of view, if you will, I'm sure the Pentagon thought of that as a public relations problem.
A month after the surrender of Iraqi forces in Operation Desert Storm, President George H.W. Bush moved unilaterally to denuclearize the U.S. Army, including the neutron bomb.
I am announcing today a series of sweeping initiatives affecting every aspect of our nuclear forces on land, on ships, and on aircraft. I'll begin with the category in which we will make the most fundamental change in nuclear forces in over 40 years, non-strategic or theater weapons. I'm therefore directing that the United States eliminate its entire worldwide inventory of ground-launched, short-range, that is, theater, nuclear weapons. We will bring home and destroy all of our nuclear artillery shells and short-range ballistic missile warheads.
We have 0. Thanks to 2 guys, General Colin Powell, who advised President George Herbert Walker Bush, this is right after the Persian Gulf War, to get rid of all of the battlefield nuclear weapons. He didn't need them, he didn't want them, and so Bush put forth an edict, destroy all these weapons. And so here were all these thousands of weapons, which were destroyed, including my neutron bomb. For the time being, it's gone for all time. What I've always told myself is not a question of if, but when. The bombs that I've been discussing are the bombs we've actually developed. And so I've talked about their nature and their effects and so on and so forth. But let's talk about another bomb. And I have a nickname for this. I was the first guy to become aware of this bomb and its implications. And this bomb I call the nothing bomb. It doesn't duck down buildings. It doesn't contaminate the surface over a huge area or anything else like that. But there's one thing that it does do, so it's not a totally nothing bomb. It kills people with neutrons from a device, roughly speaking, the size of a baseball, and a yield, not kilotons, but at the ton level. And that makes it the ultimate radiation weapon, the ultimate neutron bomb. And it was based, technically, on a very exotic substance to get the super effective explosives, for a peaceful application. And it involves an explosive that didn't go bang. Instead, what it did is it got extremely hot. And it glowed white hot. And inside that glowing material, the pressures were enormous beyond imagination. They were comparable to the temperatures and pressures that existed in the inside of the sun. Now, you know what the sun does. It produces thermonuclear reactions, where the ingredients are the two heavy forms of hydrogen, deuterium and tritium, which are the same ingredients of a regular neutron bomb. This one is pure fusion. And would you like to know something? Despite all these treaties and agreements we've reached regarding nuclear arms control, for a country to produce these kinds of explosives is strictly permissible. Not one treaty that's ever come out, not one agreement that's ever come out has forbidden the development of such devices. So I don't claim any God-given uniqueness as being the only one on earth that really understands what this business is all about. I don't. I never have, and I never will. It's not about logic, and it's not about rationality, and I'll add one, it's not even about sanity. My thinking along nuclear weapon lines and what kinds of weapons ought to be developed and stockpiled and so on has been my moral view of the subject of nuclear weapons and their use and how they ought to be used. I'm being more than a little bit overly pompous here in claiming my morality, because I ain't that moral. I've still got a lot of meanings inside of me, but good. Despite all the years of psychoanalysis I went through. But I'm, relatively speaking, whether you want to make the morality, a far more moral person than I was before the analysis. And not only more moral, but more rational.
And we have Ray on the line, and she had a question. Ray, what's your question?
My question is, why do I need to wait for 18 hours to die? Why can't I just, up and die? Would it be better if one had a gun, or if one had a supply of pills, and then one would just down it and pass out or shoot one's brains out instead of suffering the 18 hours?
I would say, for me, I'm just going to get a bottle of Jack.
tactical, practical. It's theoretically factual, all without the mess and the moral delay at the end of a business day. Fallout's finished, a thing of the past. Everything left is intact. You can move in today. Did I happen to say, just toss those other folks out of your way? We still have time for a neutron song. One more neutron song. We still have time for a neutron bomb before this world is gone. Oppenheimer, Teller, Livermore, Sam once held the world in the palm of their hands. If you could ask them today, they might actually say there may be no one left to blow away. If you see the light on a nuclear night, duck and cover just as fast as you can, and hold on tight when might makes right, and pray tomorrow is a better day. We still have time for a neutron song. One more neutron song.